In the year of our Lord 1386, a peculiar darkness settled over the village of Savigny-sur-Rating. It was not a darkness of plague or war, though those were familiar visitors to the land, but a darkness born of a different kind of fear, the fear of the unnatural, the fear of the beast within. Jean Lecoq, a simple farmer, watched the darkening sky with worry. His crops were failing, and the recent rains had turned his fields to mud. Little did he know, the troubles in his field were only the beginning. The tragedy struck the family of Gilles Ginot. Their infant son, barely old enough to walk, was found lifeless near the pigsty. Panic seized the villagers. The whispers began almost immediately. Jean, among the first to arrive at the Ginots' cottage, voiced the unspoken fear. It was the sow. I saw her near the child earlier, along with her piglets. The accused sow, a beast of considerable size, belonged to a neighboring farmer. She was known for her aggressive temperament, especially when protecting her young. The village priest, Father Simon, a man of stern faith and unwavering belief in divine justice, addressed the growing unease. We must seek justice for this heinous act. This is not merely a tragedy but a sign. Jean, along with other able-bodied men, apprehended the sow and her litter. They were bound and dragged through the village, their squeals piercing the tense silence. Confined within a crudely constructed pen in the town square, the sow and her piglets became the focus of the villagers' collective grief and anger. Stones were thrown, curses hurled. The line between justice and vengeance blurred. Magister Petrus Arnauld, a local scholar known for his knowledge of law and philosophy, watched the spectacle with a mixture of curiosity and concern. He questioned the wisdom of acting in haste, advocating for deliberation and reasoned judgment. Father Simon, driven by the community's demand for retribution, took charge. A makeshift court was established. The priest declared, "We shall hold a trial, a righteous trial, to determine the guilt of these beasts before God and man." Jean Lecoq, fueled by the grief of the Ginot family and the fear for his own children, became the chief accuser. He recounted the events leading up to the tragedy, painting a vivid picture of the sow's alleged malice. The sow, oblivious to the gravity of the accusations, remained silent. The trial was set to begin. The fate of the sow, and perhaps the village itself, hung in the balance, a testament to the strange and often unsettling intersection of faith, fear, and justice in the medieval world. News of the Savigny-sur-Rating pig case reached Bishop Bartholomew Chassanet in Dijon. He had made a name for himself, or perhaps infamy, with his legal arguments on behalf of creatures great and small. The villagers, desperate for any form of assistance, had sent a messenger appealing to his peculiar expertise. Jean Lecoq, like the rest of Savigny, watched the bishop's approach. He clutched his worn hat, unsure if this bewigged cleric could possibly understand the weight of their misfortune. Chassanet, despite his imposing vestments, possessed an air of quiet contemplation. He knew the skepticism he faced. Animal trials were, after all, a subject of ridicule for some and a source of genuine distress for others. Magister Petrus Arnauld, the village's resident scholar, watched from the periphery. He had read Chassanet's legal treatises and found them unusual, to say the least. He was interested to see how the bishop would approach the matter. That evening, Chassanet met with the local priest, poring over the details of the case. He listened intently, asking pointed questions about the circumstances of the pig's alleged crime and the sentiments of the villagers. Jean Lecoq could barely sleep. The thought of the trial of the pig escaping justice gnawed at him. He feared for his children and the other children of Savigny. What if the beast struck again? The following morning, Chassanet prepared for the trial. He meticulously reviewed depositions, witness testimonies, and any scrap of evidence he could find. He needed to understand the pig's perspective, if such a thing were possible. Magister Arnauld, too, prepared. He gathered his own notes, outlining his thoughts on the trial's absurdity and the philosophical implications of holding an animal accountable for its actions. Chassanet wrestled with the defense. How could he possibly argue on behalf of a pig accused of such a heinous crime? He considered the arguments of original sin, of animal instinct, of societal responsibility. Jean Lecoq, unable to shake his fear, sharpened his tools. He knew it was wrong, but he wondered if justice would truly be served in the courtroom. He felt a primal urge to protect his family, no matter the cost. Magister Arnauld gathered a small crowd. He presented his arguments, not to condone the pig's actions, but to question the very premise of the trial. Was it truly justice, or simply a reflection of their own fears and anxieties? As the sun climbed higher, Chassanet walked into the makeshift courtroom, ready to face the challenge ahead. The fate of the pig, and perhaps the sanity of Savigny-sur-Reting, rested on his shoulders. The day of the trial dawned grim and overcast. Savigny-sur-Reting had never witnessed such a spectacle. The air crackled with a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and righteous indignation. The makeshift courtroom was abuzz with murmurs as the villagers gathered. Bishop Chassanet, though undoubtedly apprehensive, possessed a certain gravitas. He attempted to project an air of confidence, though the absurdity of the situation was likely not lost on him. He knew this trial would be one for the ages. Jean Lecoq stood amongst the throng, his face a mask of grim determination. This was not just about the death of a child. It was about justice, about protecting his family and livelihood from the perceived threat of the animal kingdom. Then came the accused. The sow, massive and reeking of the sty, was hauled into the square. Her piglets, mere extensions of her, squealed in terror. The sight of the animals, clearly confused and distressed, elicited a mix of pity and revulsion from the crowd. The trial began with the formal reading of the charges. The bailiff, a man whose voice seemed amplified by the very stones of the square, recounted the gruesome details of the child's death, laying the blame squarely on the sow and her offspring. Chassanet rose to speak, his voice echoing in the square. He argued for the sow, reminding the court that animals, though capable of violence, lacked the same moral understanding as humans. He pleaded for reason and compassion. Jean Lecoq countered with raw emotion. He described the horror of discovering his child's mangled body, painting a vivid picture of the sow's alleged brutality. His words struck a chord with the villagers, fueling their desire for retribution. Magister Arnauld, standing at the periphery, observed the spectacle with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. He whispered quietly, "The very notion of holding an animal accountable in a court of law is a perversion of justice. Yet here we are, trapped in this medieval theater of the absurd." The judges listened with an air of solemnity, weighing the conflicting arguments. The fate of the sow, and perhaps the very fabric of the village's understanding of justice, hung in the balance. Witness after witness recounted tales of the sow's alleged malevolence. Each story, embellished with fear and suspicion, further solidified the villagers' belief in the animal's guilt. As the testimonies piled up against the sow, Chassanet's hope dwindled. He knew the power of fear and superstition, and he realized that reason might not be enough to sway the court. He could not help but feel defeated. Arnold watched with a detached sense of inevitability. He understood the societal forces at play, the deep-seated need for scapegoats in a world filled with uncertainty. He knew that justice, in this case, was merely a performance, a way to assuage the villagers' fears, regardless of the truth. The courtroom held its breath. Bishop Chassanet, counsel for the Sow, prepared to mount his defense. The weight of the village's grief and fear pressed upon him, yet his resolve remained unwavering. He began by acknowledging the horror of the child's death, a tragedy that weighed heavily on all present. However, he argued, justice demanded reason, not simply retribution. Could an animal truly be held morally accountable in the same way as a human? Magister Arnold, seated among the learned observers, watched with a critical eye. He respected Chassanet's intellect but remained unconvinced by the notion of animal culpability. The scholar questioned the very basis of applying human legal constructs to beasts driven by instinct. Chassanet turned to Scripture. He cited passages that spoke of God's dominion over all creatures, arguing that animals were instruments of divine will, incapable of independent moral reasoning. If the Sow had acted with violence, was it not possible, he suggested, that she was an unwitting vessel for a darker force? Jean Lecoq, a local peasant farmer, watched Chassanet with growing frustration. The farmer's livelihood was threatened by animal criminals. Such theological arguments did little to soothe his grief or ease his fear of future attacks. He saw only a beast that had taken a life, not a pawn of divine will. Chassanet pressed on, drawing upon philosophical texts. He cited Aristotle's observations on the animal soul, or rather, the lack thereof. Animals, he argued, lacked the capacity for rational thought, and therefore could not be held to the same moral standards as humans. Arnold, though still skeptical, found himself intrigued. Chassanet's arguments, while unconventional, were rooted in established intellectual traditions. The question remained, could these traditions truly justify absolving a creature of such a heinous act? He then presented a more radical proposition, that the Sow might have been possessed, a vessel for demonic influence. Such cases, though rare, were not unheard of. If the animal was indeed under the sway of evil, could it truly be blamed for its actions? A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The idea of demonic possession, though terrifying, was not entirely alien to the villagers. Yet, for Jean Lecoq, it was simply another excuse, another attempt to evade justice. To demonstrate the possibility of demonic influence, Chassanet produced a vial of holy water. He sprinkled it towards the Sow, reciting a prayer of exorcism. The act was met with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The Sow remained impassive, showing no visible reaction to the holy water or the incantation. This lack of response, however, could be interpreted in two ways, either as proof that the animal was innocent of demonic influence or as evidence of the devil's cunning, a refusal to yield to divine power. Chassanet concluded his defense, leaving the judges to ponder the complexities of the case. He had presented a tapestry of legal arguments, theological interpretations, and philosophical musings, all in an attempt to shield a creature deemed guilty by popular opinion. The fate of the Sow, and perhaps the very notion of animal justice, now hung in the balance. The courtroom was thick with anticipation, the air heavy with the scent of sweat and unwashed bodies. Bishop Chassanet stood, his face a mask of professional stoicism, as the judge, a stern-faced man in his late 60s, prepared to pronounce judgment. The fate of the Sow, and by extension, the village, hung in the balance. Jean Lecoq fidgeted on the hard wooden bench, his gaze fixed on the judge. He was a simple man, a farmer, and he struggled to understand the intricacies of the law. All he knew was that a child was dead and a pig was responsible. Justice, he hoped, would be served. Magister Arnold watched the spectacle unfold with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. The legal arguments, the emotional appeals, the sheer absurdity of the situation. It was all a reflection of the human condition, a strange dance between reason and superstition. The judge cleared his throat and unrolled the parchment. His voice, amplified by the silence, echoed through the room. "By the authority vested in this court," he began, and the village held its breath. "The sow is found guilty of infanticide and is sentenced to be hanged by the neck until dead. The piglets, due to their youth and apparent lack of malice, are acquitted and returned to their owner." A murmur rippled through the room. Chassanet closed his eyes briefly, a sigh escaping his lips. He had done his best, but justice in this case had taken a different turn. Jean Lecoq scowled. The sow was to be punished, yes, but the piglets. They were part of the same litter, the same bloodline. Would they not carry the same violent tendencies? The acquittal of the piglets left a bitter taste in his mouth, a seed of unease planted in his heart. The execution was swift and brutal. The sow, squealing in terror, was dragged to the town square, a makeshift gallows erected for the occasion. The villagers watched in silence as the executioner did his grim work. It was a spectacle of medieval justice, a stark reminder of the power of the law, even over the creatures of the field. A heavy silence descended upon the village as the sow's lifeless body swung from the gallows. Some villagers felt a sense of closure, a sense that justice had been served. Others remained troubled, unsure if this act of violence had truly restored peace to their community. Later that day, Jean Lecoq watched as the piglets were returned to their pen. They seemed innocent enough, snuffling and playing as if nothing had happened. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were a danger, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. He kept his distance, his hand never far from the heavy stick he now carried at all times. In his study, Magister Arnold pondered the events of the day. The trial, the verdict, the execution. It was all so barbaric, so illogical. Yet he couldn't deny the very real fear that gripped the village, the desperate need for order in a world that often seemed chaotic and unpredictable. Perhaps, he thought, these animal trials served a purpose, a way for a frightened community to regain control, even if that control was based on superstition and fear. Bishop Chassanet left Savigny-sur-Reading the next morning, the image of the hanging sow etched in his mind. He had seen justice served, of a kind, but he knew that the deeper questions, the questions about humanity's relationship with the natural world, remained unanswered. He rode on, his path leading him to other villages, other trials, other strange and unsettling cases of bestial justice. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the fields, Jean Lecoq stood watch over his farm. The sow was gone, but the piglets remained. He knew in his heart that the threat had not truly passed. He would remain vigilant, forever haunted by the memory of the child who had been taken, and forever wary of the creatures that shared his world. The wheel of the year turned, and with it, misfortune struck the fields of France. It wasn't a wolf, nor a boar this time, but something far smaller, more insidious. Weevils. Jean Lecoq, like many others, watched his livelihood wither before his eyes. Each day, more grain succumbed to the tiny invaders. Desperation began to set in. Whispers of divine displeasure grew louder. The harvest was the lifeblood of the community, and the weevils threatened to drain it dry. Seeking answers, the villagers turned to the church. Surely the blight was a sign, a test, or perhaps even a punishment from God. Magister Arnold, though skeptical of attributing moral agency to insects, knew the desperation of the people. He understood the symbolic power of the Church's intervention. A decision was made. The weevils would be brought to justice, not in the earthly courts but before God himself. News of the impending excommunication reached Bishop Chassanet. He found himself, once again, contemplating the strange intersection of faith, law, and the animal kingdom. A formal request was sent to the bishop, detailing the weevils' crimes and requesting their excommunication. It was a desperate plea, written in the language of canon law. Jean, along with the rest of the village, waited. Would the church intervene? Would God hear their prayers and banish the tiny destroyers? Chassanet, ever the lawyer, recognized the absurdity of the situation. Yet, he also understood the power of belief and the importance of maintaining order, even in the face of the seemingly irrational. He sought the counsel of Magister Arnold, seeking a perspective that transcended the immediate crisis. Was there a philosophical basis for such actions, or was it merely superstition dressed in the garb of law? Whether by divine intervention, a change in the weather, or simply the natural life cycle of the weevils, the infestation eventually subsided. But the memory of the trial and the question of animal justice lingered in the air. The concept of excommunication for animals, though unsettling to modern sensibilities, was rooted in the medieval understanding of God's creation. All creatures, it was believed, were subject to divine law, and thus capable of spiritual transgression. When animals committed acts deemed harmful to the community, the Church, in its role as spiritual shepherd, could invoke the power of excommunication. For Jean Lecoq, the theological justifications were less important than the practical consequences. Excommunication, in theory, meant that the weevils were cast out from the grace of God, but would that truly stop them from devouring his precious grain? The question gnawed at him, a constant reminder of his precarious existence. Magister Arnold, ever the intellectual, viewed the excommunication process with a critical eye. He questioned the theological soundness of applying spiritual penalties to creatures incapable of understanding sin in the human sense. Was it truly justice, or merely a reflection of human anxieties projected onto the natural world? In accordance with canonical procedure, a priest was appointed as the weevil's advocate. This was not an endorsement of their actions, but rather an acknowledgement that even the smallest of creatures deserved a voice, a chance to plead their case before the divine and earthly authorities. The priest, tasked with the unenviable role of defending the weevils, argued that their actions were driven by instinct, not malice. They were simply creatures fulfilling their God-given purpose, unaware of the damage they inflicted on human livelihoods. Jean Lecoq listened to the priest's plea, a flicker of hope igniting within him. Could these tiny destroyers be spared? Could his crops be saved? The fate of his family hung in the balance, dependent on the outcome of this extraordinary trial. Bishop Chassanet, though not directly involved in this particular case, followed the proceedings with interest. He recognized the inherent contradictions in these animal trials, the blending of legal and theological principles, and the often tenuous link between the accused and the perceived crime. Magister Arnold, speaking to a colleague, argued that the trial was a misapplication of justice. He pondered the very nature of law and whether it could, or should, apply to creatures incapable of understanding its principles. The village council, composed of local elders and church representatives, faced a difficult decision. They were torn between their duty to protect the community and their adherence to the principles of justice, however unconventional. The reality of the situation was undeniable. The weevils were multiplying, threatening to decimate the harvest and bring starvation to the village. Something had to be done, but what was the right course of action? As the council deliberated, Jean Lecoq could only wait and hope. The fate of his family, his livelihood, and his very existence rested on the outcome of this bizarre trial, a testament to the strange and often unsettling world of medieval justice. The animal trials continued, a persistent reminder of the medieval worldview, where the lines between the human and animal, the earthly and divine, were often blurred, and where even the smallest of creatures could find themselves facing the full weight of the law and the church. The case of the weevils threatened to split the very fabric of the community. Bishop Chassanet, despite his earlier role defending animals, understood the gravity of the situation. The livelihood of the villagers hung in the balance. Jean Lecoq, representing the anguished farmers, argued passionately for the excommunication. "Our crops are our lives," he cried. "These creatures are not merely pests, they are a plague sent to destroy us." Magister Arnauld, ever the detached observer, pondered the arguments. He questioned the very notion of holding animals accountable for their natural behavior, but he also acknowledged the desperation of the villagers. Chassanet listened to Jean Lecoq's heartfelt plea. The farmer described the devastation, fields reduced to barren wastelands, families facing starvation. "How can we feed our children when these creatures devour everything?" he lamented. The priest appointed to defend the weevils, a man of deep faith and compassion, argued for the sanctity of all life. "Every creature, no matter how small, is a part of God's creation," he declared. "Are we to condemn them for acting according to their nature?" Jean Lecoq countered, "But what of our lives? Are we not also God's creation? Are we to starve while these creatures feast?" He accused the priest of prioritizing insects over human lives. Magister Arnauld, in a private conversation with Chassanet, questioned the efficacy of excommunication. "Will these creatures truly understand the consequences?" he asked. "Or is this merely a symbolic act to appease the villagers?" Chassanet admitted the limitations of the process. "We are treading uncharted waters, Magister," he confessed, "but we must offer the villagers some semblance of justice, some hope in the face of despair." The priest, unwavering in his belief, prayed for a miracle. He asked God to intervene, to guide the weevils to another source of sustenance, to spare the villagers from starvation. Meanwhile, Jean Lecoq led the villagers in a desperate plea for divine help. They marched through the ravaged fields, chanting prayers and carrying religious banners, begging God to protect them from the tiny invaders. Magister Arnauld, ever seeking knowledge, delved into ancient texts, searching for precedents or philosophical arguments that might justify or condemn the proceedings. He sought wisdom from the past to understand the present. Bishop Chassanet, faced with the conflicting arguments and the immense pressure from the community, knew he had a monumental decision to make. The fate of the village, and perhaps the precedent for future such cases, rested in his hands. The pronouncement was delivered with the full weight of the church behind it. The weevils, those tiny destroyers of the harvest, were excommunicated. Bishop Chassanet, though perhaps harboring doubts, performed the ceremony with unwavering gravity. Jean Lecoq watched from the edge of his field, the golden wheat swaying gently in the breeze, a stark reminder of what he stood to lose. The excommunication was a strange remedy, a spiritual weapon against a physical threat. Magister Arnold, ever the observer, stood apart. He questioned the efficacy of such pronouncements, wondering if divine judgment truly extended to creatures so small, so driven by instinct. The words of excommunication echoed through the church, a solemn Latin incantation intended to sever the weevils from the grace of God and the community of believers. Each phrase was delivered with deliberate weight. Back in his field, Jean Lecoq knelt, examining a stalk of wheat. The weevils were still there, seemingly unaffected by the pronouncements of the church. Doubt gnawed at him. Was this truly the answer? And Magister Arnold approached Bishop Chassanet after the ceremony. "Your Grace," he said, "do you truly believe this will have an effect, or is it merely a symbolic gesture to appease the villagers?" Bishop Chassanet sighed. "I do not know, Magister, but we must offer them something. Hope, perhaps, even if it is only the hope that God will intervene where we cannot." In the village square, Jean Lecoq joined the hushed discussions. Some villagers clung to the belief that the excommunication would work. Others, hardened by years of hardship, remained skeptical. All were desperate. Meanwhile, in the fields, the weevils continued their relentless work. The excommunication, it seemed, had gone unanswered. The tiny creatures multiplied, their impact growing with each passing day. Bishop Chassanet knelt in the darkened church, the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him. He prayed for guidance, for a sign, for some relief from the suffering that had befallen his flock. The days that followed brought no miracle. The weevils continued their devastation, leaving Jean Lecoq and his fellow villagers facing a grim harvest and a bleaker winter. The excommunication had been performed, but the fields remained blighted. Magister Arnold, in the quiet of his study, continued to ponder the events. The excommunication of the weevils was a testament to the medieval mind, a blend of faith, superstition, and desperate hope. But as he wrote, he wondered if such acts truly served justice, or merely masked the helplessness of humanity against the forces of nature. The practice of animal trials, so peculiar to our modern sensibilities, began to wane as the medieval period drew to a close. The precise reasons are multifaceted, a confluence of shifting philosophical views, evolving legal frameworks, and the slow erosion of deeply held superstitions. Scholars like Magister Arnold began to question the very basis of these trials. The application of human law to creatures incapable of understanding it seemed increasingly absurd. The rise of humanism, with its emphasis on human reason and individual worth, further undermined the rationale for holding animals accountable in the same way as men and women. For men like Jean Lecoq, the decline of animal trials brought a sense of unease. While the legal proceedings were often costly and disruptive, they offered a sense of control over the unpredictable forces of nature. The fading of these trials left a void, a feeling that the balance between humanity and the natural world was somehow disturbed. Bishop Chassanet, despite his frequent involvement in these cases, never fully embraced the notion of animal culpability. He saw the trials more as a means of appeasing the community, of channeling anxieties into a structured process, however flawed. He believed in God's creatures, but also recognized the limitations of applying human justice to them. The courtrooms that once echoed with accusations against pigs, weevils, and dogs fell silent. The legal books that detailed the procedures for these trials gathered dust in forgotten corners of libraries. The era of bestial justice was slowly fading into memory. Yet the questions raised by these trials lingered. What is the relationship between humanity and the natural world? What are our responsibilities to the creatures that share our planet? Magister Arnold continued to explore these themes in his lectures, challenging his students to think critically about the nature of justice and the boundaries of human understanding. Jean Lecoq, now older and wiser, continued to work his land, facing the challenges of each season with a renewed sense of respect for the delicate balance of nature. He taught his children the old ways, but also encouraged them to seek new knowledge and to question the traditions of the past. Bishop Chassanet, in his later years, committed his thoughts to paper, attempting to make sense of the era of animal trials. He recognized them as a reflection of a society grappling with fear, superstition, and a profound uncertainty about its place in the world. The legacy of bestial justice remains, a bizarre chapter in the history of law and human thought. It serves as a reminder of the complex and often contradictory ways in which societies attempt to understand and control the natural world. Today, these trials are studied by historians and legal scholars, providing insights into the medieval worldview and the evolution of legal thought. They offer a glimpse into a time when the line between humanity and the animal kingdom was blurred, when the laws of men were applied, however imperfectly, to all creatures great and small. The fields of France still yield their bounty, the forests still teem with life. The echoes of animal trials may have faded, but the fundamental questions they raised about justice, responsibility, and our place in the natural order continue to resonate. The story of bestial justice serves as a testament to the evolving nature of human understanding, a reminder that even the most deeply held beliefs can be challenged and transformed by the passage of time and the enduring power of reason.